Hello. Thanks, everybody. So I wanted to just briefly say that, first of all, everybody should go to the panel that's happening at 2 o'clock. That panel is about what it takes to play in the physical digital space. It's a star-studded panel. I'm sure some of the panelists are in the audience. And I'm personally really excited to go and hear a lot about what some very innovative firms are doing, thinking about what it takes to work in the physical and digital space. But we wanted to talk this morning, I think, a little bit about why we should be playing in the physical and digital space. The theme of the one show this year is creativity for good. And I think that means we have to ask ourselves a lot of pretty important questions about what the work we're doing is affecting in the world and how this collision of physical and digital worlds are affecting our audiences, our consumers, and citizens at large. So that's sort of the general kickoff. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work. We're going to follow, I think, a somewhat unconventional format. We're going to give short 5-minute per person presentations of one piece of work or maybe a couple pieces of work. And then we're going to open up questions to the audience. I'm hoping that we'll get a lively discussion going here. The purpose is to make this as participatory as possible. So with that, Eric Howler.
So my name is Eric Howler. I'm an architect. My firm's called Howler & Yoon Architecture. We're in Boston. I also teach design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So I sort of straddle the kind of practice and academic divide. I'm going to show you one project, one idea. Hopefully there's more ideas than one. It's a 5-minute presentation for a project we did a couple years ago as part of the Audi Urban Future Initiative. And Audi, as a car maker, realized that they're not just making cars and selling cars, but actually selling mobility. They hired 6 different architects to do a study that would look at different geographic regions and shift the focus from the car to the context. So what do architects know about cars? Not much, but we do know about the context in which the cars operate. So we did a project, we call it the Shareway, and I'm going to show it to you just now. The region we inhabit is Boswash. It's between Boston and Washington, and that is a mega region. Within that mega region, you find all forms of American urbanization. And so for our project, we looked at Boswash for the year 2030. And the premise was that Boswash is a byproduct of the American dream, and what better way to shape the American landscape than by sort of reimagining the American dream. So the idea of the American dream has shaped every aspect of American culture, the built environment, our consumer cultures, and so on. So as architects, we thought, how has that impacted architecture, the built environment? The idea of freedom, of personal space, of territory, of the American city, and the suburb are all things that were produced. They're not just sort of inherent. And those were not just about desire, but also about design. And so how could design sort of reformat the idea of an American dream? And we thought maybe we could offer an alternative by reimagining mobility in the Boswash region. So the images that you'll see shortly are images of the American urban landscape, of suburban houses, of highways, of sprawl, of strip malls. And this is something that maybe weren't designed by architects, but designed by somebody. And somebody created this desire for these conditions. It was kind of top-down thinking in terms of the Eisenhower kind of Interstate Highway Act, but also bottom-up sort of, I want this backyard, I want this barbecue. In the context of that sort of American dream, we thought, well, how does mobility function? It's so intertwined with American cities, you can't sort of untangle the kind of cul-de-sac from the suburban house that it's sort of attached to. Yeah. And as we looked around, we discovered that the kind of American infrastructure that we were talking about was becoming rapidly obsolete. Highways were sort of crumbling. As China builds brand new elevated roadways, our American highways were sort of falling into the rivers. So at the same time, Obama was saying we're going to spend all this money on infrastructure. So that seemed like a good cue that we should sort of rethink that. So one of the things we did, and I'm really wishing we had some images as well. One of the things we did is we imagined the territory along the East Coast between Washington and Boston, what we called Boswash. And it's really along the I-95 corridor. So if you think about the highway that connects these cities. And what is we're good? Okay, maybe we could play the video then. Okay, so this is a kind of campaign we came up with, I Love Boswash. So these are familiar images of the American urban and suburban landscape, the kind of interchange. And this dream became a kind of mirage, you know, with the kind of crumbling infrastructure. You know, this is the bridge in Minneapolis that collapsed. Obama's pledging money for infrastructure. And so we said, let's reimagine ourselves as citizens of Boswash, not as Bostonians or New Yorkers. And how do we sort of take all the existing mobility and bundle it together? So the highway, separate from the train, separate from these different, what we call mobility ecologies, how do we bring them together? So we thought in the year 2030, we could create something called the bundle, which would sort of take the existing right-of-way of the I-95 corridor and put the high-speed train on top of that. We also imagine that it's not just a hardware solution, but it's actually a kind of software interface. So how do we help people sort of navigate this new territory of interconnected, intermodal connections, we call them switches, to create a new space of transit. And that's a social space, it's a business space, it's a space where you might choose to be and not just sort of need to be. The bundle enters the city, it sort of frays out and makes connections within the city, but always sort of creating new sight lines and new vistas sort of the city and over the city. We also found new territories within the American landscape, these kind of crescent-shaped gaps between a kind of a highway speed and a train speed. And in those gaps, we propose new uses, new activities, new programs. We also propose this idea of a kind of last mile car, that you don't have to own the car, but you could share it. And the problem with American mobility is we can't get to our house, which is a mile from the last station, so we tend to drive. But how could those little last mile cars be sort of integrated into the bundle? And here you see them kind of distributing from a last mile train station into the city and making that sort of link. So these kind of shared cars could also represent a shift to a kind of idea of shared everything, shared houses. You know, could we give up our owned house that's being foreclosed and take up new kind of collective consumption models, like shifting from ownership to membership, not just where to stay, but when to stay. The claim of car sharing is that it takes cars off the road. Maybe we could do the same for the suburban house and shift the values of the American dream from like my house and my yard to the time that I can use this house. And I have choices of like, well, I want it on weekends, I want it in the suburbs. And so we design these kind of interfaces for like how urban, how long, when am I coming home, between what hours. And we imagine this sort of integrated into the bundle as a kind of high density integrated system of hardware, but also the software to sort of access these at different times. We had a lot of fun with the designing cars and vehicles, but really we thought, how could we get to the suburb by sort of designing these moments? And the suburban house is not just something to be in, but also to look at. So this is a kind of proposal for a para house, which sort of occupies the cul-de-sac. You're there between 8 a.m. and 12, and then somebody else is there between 1 and 2. And trying to imagine the suburb as a kind of network of users and members. We also realized that despite the information age, so much of mobility is physical, moving goods, moving things, moving people. So we looked at Newark and we said, maybe this is the new center for Boswash. Maybe there's a new kind of super hub that could land here, that could take in ships and rail and a new air terminal to sort of bring everything together in one sort of major mobility hub that would sort of gather everything together. So we had fun sort of designing what Newark sort of already is, which is a super hub, but it does occupy a kind of new centroid of the region. So this was based on the kind of landing strip of an Airbus A380 and the turning radius of a high-speed train that might come together in this one place. The last thing we did, we provided all these little bits of design. So the roadway, could we rethink the road as opposed to this kind of contentious relationship between bikes and cars as something that's transformable, so that people and cars and bikes are separated not in space but in time. So when you need to drive, it becomes a roadway. When you need to park, it becomes a park. It generates energy. So it's a kind of a resilient, responsive road surface that can transform the city from a kind of asphalt highway to a kind of partial park to a temporal park. So these were all proposals that we looked at for this shareway concept for 2030 that are kind of anticipatory visions. They're not science fictions. they're really looking at trends and sort of mapping those out. And we argued that the issues that they touch on, collectivity, urbanity, technology, resources, those are all parts of the American dream. And by rethinking those desires that we have for the American dream, maybe we could rethink and reinvent the American landscape through this alternative American dream. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm good.
I want to live in Eric's world. So we're going to move on to, my name is Muna Andreos, and I run and co-founded a design studio called Daily Tous les Jours. And we focus on creating kind of large-scale collective experiences to generate engagement. And most of our work over the past 4 years has been in the public space. And so in the next 5 or so minutes, I'll show you 3 sampler of projects that we've been invited to do, ranging from a little bit more of a commission by a corporate company all the way to working with the city or working with cultural institutions. All in all, the whole team is pretty much interaction designers. We worked a lot in the virtual space for a while until we decided we wanted to get back into the physical area and started doing interactive installations and really took to the streets to go meet our public where they were and generate these kinds of interaction. So in the context of a conversation about how do we make places, really our focus has been on people and starting from an understanding of the experience of our participants and then building from there different narratives. The first project that I'll show you is called the Conversation Wall. It was a commission by a bank, an Oregon-based bank called Umpqua Bank. Umpqua is a community bank, and they thrive on trying to generate economic developments in the communities that they move into. So they'll open a new branch they call stores, and then try to really understand who's around and build products and experiences for them. So they called us up when they opened up their new South Lake Union branch, or store, I should say. And in South Lake Union is a booming neighborhood, completely transforming, and they wanted to create a long-lasting conversation with the audience there. But it's a community that's completely transforming. It's hard to understand who they are. And so we figured for Umpqua Bank, we would install a gigantic sign in their facade and just ask people, what would they like to talk about? So it's a neon sign that says, we want to have a conversation about blank. And people can just fill in with using text message different proposals. And what we're designing for them is a series of events that will be hosted inside the bank where people will just come in and actually have conversations about the topics that were most popular. Inside the store, we also installed a more low-tech version of the conversation wall, inviting people to just fill out cards that are gathered together. So over the course of 2-3 months, we're starting to curate these events. The first one will be called Dog, Wines, and Salt, turning what we love into what we do, inviting guests and opportunities to talk about how we can bring more passion into businesses. So Umpqua Bank has been one experiment in using the street as a first place to engage people. The second project is called 21 Swing. In this case, we're in Montreal, in the downtown area that's been completely transforming over the past 5-10 years. And the strip of land that you see there is in between 2 fairly busy streets and had been in constructions for many years when the city invited us to try to bring it back to life and tell to the public, hey, this area is here for you. Come on over. We're behind the science faculty and behind the opera house in kind of a transient dead zone. And so we used the existing infrastructure that they had there. In particular, the city installed these multifunctional exhibition, festival type structures, and we decided to use them to make a gigantic collaborative instrument, a collaborative musical instrument for the public, choosing the swing as an interface that we would attach on their existing structure. And this is how 21 Swings was born, as an effort in which we invite people to come on board, use this interface that they recognize, the swing, and just make music. So the higher you swing, the higher the note that you make will be. But more importantly, it's by collaborating with each other that people start making more interesting musical harmonies and melodies that can emerge from that. We'll, I think, listen to a short clip. These are some images of it in the city and the mix and matches of people and interactions that came from it. And we'll listen to just a minute of that video clip to get a sense of what they sounded like. So short sampler, with the last bit being the kind of music that gets generated through synchronicity. And for us, the project represents this idea that together we can make more than alone, and as everyone works together, they can create this more gigantic experience. The project's been adopted by young and old, and was intended as a only 5-week presentation and has become a ritual. Every spring it comes back, and at night they come to life and become a space for performance, for meetups and interactions. Everyone from the neighborhood has adopted them, and they're really people's swings rather than us. We see them regularly on the news as well. During protests, they're in the backdrop, so there's all sorts of stuff that happen as that space has really become an actual destination. We knew we had hit something interesting when the local newspaper published a story someone submitted just saying, hey, goodbye the swings. Our swings are gone, try to bring them back. And the last project that I'll show you is also from the area. It's a similar revitalization program by the city. This is a large open ex-parking space. It's an entrance of a subway station, close to bars and nightlife, but a little bit of an abandoned space. And so the city collaborated with the National Film Board of Canada to try to bring content to these places and invited us to create an original work for that space. And so they identified a filmmaker from the 30s who worked all the way into the 50s called Norman McLaren, specialized in, invented all sorts of crazy different animations. And we picked one film that would be the starting point of a participatory experience to happen in that place. The original film, I'll show you a very short sample, just a few minutes. It's called The Canon, and McLaren played a lot, experimented with, this is 1953, doing visualizations of audio patterns, in this case the musical canon. And so this character comes through the screen over the course of 2-3 minutes and just in a very playful way interacts with itself, representing the visual canon. So we quickly figured we want to do a version that would use the public and the public space as an opportunity to remake a 2014 version of that film. So we'll see just a second of this. This is our in-studio prototype version of the project. And having people imitate the original actors' movements and putting them in relationship with each other as they imitate each other and create this kind of Chinese whisper effect. We'll see just a second. We were going to put this in the streets, set up a little recording studio in a container, and then installed a terrace on the grounds and made sure the terrace was hospitable enough for people to both participate and record themselves, but also just sit down, watch, engage with each other. So you go in, you do your 30-second performance, and then you're part of the show. And the place just kind of came to life, and it's been ongoing until, I think, the 1st of June, really allowing us to see what the fabric of the neighborhood might be like just through these encounters and what happens on there. So all of our work is really about bringing magic, making places, and enabling these human connections.
Okay, so I think I'm going to have to go over here and start this video. My name is David Benjamin. I am the director of the Living Architecture Lab at Columbia University, and also the founder and principal of an architecture studio in New York called The Living. And a lot of our work in both the academic lab setting and the practice involves exploring the architecture of the future through making prototypes. So we like to think big ideas, somewhat futuristically, but we also like to have our hands on actual materials in our lab bench. And to put it slightly differently, we like to address today's kind of urgent issues and problems through today's available technologies. No, I can sit over there as long as I had to give my preamble before launching my movie. So I'm just going to present this movie and talk about three kind of ideas or approaches that we have in mind when we think about responsive environments and responsive infrastructure. The first is designing ecosystems. So we think it's interesting that we could imagine designing not just a single solitary object like architects traditionally do, but designing a kind of interactive system. And this is a kind of experimental project where we started with the property of a viscous liquid. So you first saw honey dripping from a jar, familiar. If you drop that kind of viscous liquid onto a conveyor belt, it can create different patterns. And we created a kind of automated system that would create these patterns over time and layer them on top of each other. So we had a synthetic material, plastic, a natural material, which is a liquid moss, which we spray out onto this same location as the synthetic material, and it's guided by real-time information about a local community's thinking about the environment. So what does this all mean? It means we've set up a very small prototype ecosystem where we have interaction between vegetation, construction, and human ideas, all interacting together. And the point of the system was to set up the rules, to design the rules, and let it play out for 30 days with no intervention. So we see here what it looks like in one of the 30 days of this exhibit. You get a kind of layering of material. The plastic builds up according to searches about construction. The moss sprays on according to web searches about environment. And then this is a kind of time lapse of the first half of the installation. You see a kind of building up a kind of equilibrium like ecosystems have, but then of course a tipping point like ecosystems also have when the materials kind of reached a disequilibrium and then a new equilibrium is established. So we think this is an interesting approach when thinking about responsive environments, that we would design rules but not necessarily final outcomes, and that those would play out over time. Number two, designing biosensors. We've been interested in designing with digital sensors for a long time, and we've, in this project, created a system of lights that respond to physical sensors for things like water quality, presence of fish. This was an installation in the East River in New York, where we have a series of floating tubes with sensors below water, lights above water, and you get a kind of dynamic layer of light in the city, changing colors of lights, blinking lights that are signaling things about water quality, about presence of fish, and about human interaction, things that are not normally visible in our urban environment, but that we think are important to the life of the city. So you see here a tipping point in the change of colors of the lights. We also created a kind of custom text messaging system to allow humans to request information about the water, receive back real-time data, and then the lights in the public space would blink twice. And so we think of that as a sensor of human interest. The more people that text in, the more blinking of the lights. And if you're watching the lights and you see a lot of blinking, you know there's a lot of interest at that time. If you see more blinking at midnight than at 9 p.m., you know that people are more interested at that time. So it's a kind of register of our collective interest in this important issue about our urban environment. What we've been doing recently is adding to this ecosystem biological sensors in addition to digital sensors. It turns out that living mussels are actually very good at detecting water quality, and they open and close their shells at an amount and a rate that's a good detector of pollution. In fact, better than any digital sensor we have. So if you attach a small magnet and a small magnetic sensor to a mussel's shell, you can have this kind of hybrid sensor that's giving you information about the environment, and we're kind of connecting this to our interface of lights in the city. And finally, we're very interested in new technologies of biology and the possibility that we can use living organisms to both compute things for us and manufacture things for us. This is a collaborative project with a synthetic biologist at the University of Cambridge in England, where we're taking three things bacteria already do. They can generate material that's a flat, flexible sheet. They can generate material that's a solid object, a rigid object, and they can create complex spatial patterns. We can combine those functions together and make a software interface to allow us to design new types of building materials, new types of physical materials to design with. Here's a simulation. Imagine these red dots are bacteria. They're moving around in a kind of custom petri dish. They can emit more or less of a certain chemical, as you see a chemical trail here, and you can put more or less bacteria in the dish. Then you can add a second type of bacteria, so you have the green and red interacting together. And you can basically use these living organisms to manufacture new types of materials for you. that have unusual performance, that can allow things that would not otherwise be possible, but also importantly, that could allow us to use what biological systems already do, which is efficiently use energy and raw materials to make our built environment with less carbon emissions and more sustainability than our current scenario. So you get a sense of a new type of material that we can make in this process. It's flexible in some areas and rigid in some areas, so it suggests that you can make structure and skin in the same object and maybe new types of wearables or building skins or envelope for airplanes. And again, just to kind of come full circle, one of the things we think is interesting about this is thinking about the design of the ecosystem here. So you can design something small at the small scale, like the interaction of bacteria, so small you can't see them. Those affect physical objects at a much larger scale, but really in the same time, you're also designing flows of energy and resources around the world. So it's like 16 powers of 10 in the same design project. And we think that kind of design thinking is interesting and important for the future of our cities and buildings.
Fantastic, thank you. So we'll take a minute to switch over here, I think. I'm Daniel Meyers. I'm a creative director at Second Story, at the Portland office of Second Story. We're a part of Sapient Nitro. I'm going to talk a little bit about our studio. I'm also going to talk about a project called LIT that was a collaboration we recently completed with Intel over a really quick period of time for the Maker Faire in Rome. Lots of buzzwords. We're storytellers, collaborators, innovators. But most important there is physical places, right? There's this huge conversation going on right now about the significance of digital experiences, the collision of digital experiences and stories, digital experiences, and physical places. And we're interested in all of those intersections. The history of our studio is actually sort of interesting in this realm. We started in the early 90s making CD-ROM experiences, and our founders, Brad Johnson and Julie Beeler, were really interested in the ways in which new technologies were providing a new kind of agency for people in the context of narratives. And that has led up to this moment today when we're exploring that the very same implication that CD-ROMs provided, in their sort of very interesting, clunky way, in physical places, in civic spaces, in commercial spaces, in private spaces. And I think, in some ways, we are in a moment that is as clunky in terms of the integration of digital experiences in physical space as CD-ROMs were in retrospect in terms of purely digital experiences. We run a studio that's very interdisciplinary. Sometimes it's a little hard to manage how interdisciplinary it is. I'm not sure we've ever had, in the history of mankind, have there been this many different sorts of people in one room trying to make a single work product? I don't know. Like many of the folks in the audience, like many of the folks on the stage, we're using a laboratory-based methodology, or at least a loosely laboratory-based methodology, but also a physical place that is a laboratory that's allowing all of these people with different interests, different expertise to come together and see each other's work product on a daily basis and hopefully develop, as a result, coherent work at the end that is user-focused. So this requires a whole lot of experimentation with components, with people. This also requires thinking about the diversity of audiences. One of the things that we've done quite a bit of over the last 20 years is working in a museum environment. And that requires us to think a lot about a very, very diverse audience and delivering very specific, very targeted messages to that diverse audience. We also like to have fun. We like to visualize stuff. So this brings us to immersion, right? What is this thing, immersion? This is, I think, why our present moment is both very important and very difficult, because it's hard for us to define exactly what immersion is. We, I think, have become very good at making imaginary worlds that give us a very deep sense of immersion, as long as we are embedded in this digital imaginary interface. And I want to talk about interface later. We've all three defined interface in different ways. But we're physical people. We live in the physical world. And the reality is that our interfaces are both imaginary and physical. And so what's the meaning of all those connections? So I'm going to look at LIT now really quickly. This was a very quick turn project. Intel is in our backyard, and we collaborate with them regularly. They're a fantastic partner. they were launching a development board called the Galileo. They have since followed up with a couple of other products that are even smaller than the Galileo board, which is meant to be a very powerful but readily usable maker or DIY development board. And they were excited for us to collaborate with them on a project that would showcase the capabilities of this board, but would also become a project that would be open source and that would become available to participants at the Maker Faire Rome and people online to hack, to use, to create new tools from. There we go. So has anybody been to Maker Faire? Anyone raise their hand, been to Maker Faire? It's just a totally amazing event. It's incredible the kinds of the unexpected things that you run across when you go to Maker Faire. It's an event that is for creative technologists. People come with all sorts of wacky contraptions that they've built from parts that are laying around and from pieces of code that are laying around. It's like the future bazaar in some ways. So we were tasked with making an experience that would be relevant in that context. A couple of years prior to this, one of our founders, Julie Beeler, and I had the brilliant idea of creating a presentation tool that would allow people to draw on top of our presentation while we were lecturing, which turned out to be a terrible idea in case anybody is interested in doing that. But in the process of developing that tool, we built some software that made a very simple, very easy connection between mobile devices and a display of any kind that was able to be contacted via a local wireless network. So we utilized that code for Lit and realized that it was also easily packageable. It's a piece of code that could easily be communicated to makers and could be utilized for all sorts of neat stuff. In the case of Lit, you connect via your mobile device to this local wireless network, and then you're able to draw on top of a light fixture, essentially. So these are each of these discrete units that you see here. I'm going to go to the next slide and see if we can see that upper center slide there. Each of those units consists of a couple of strips of controllable, addressable RGB LEDs. And you're essentially turning a very low resolution display into a light fixture and vice versa. And the more of these you stack together, the larger the resolution of the display. And you're able to draw on top of them. Up to 500 people can connect simultaneously and have a collaborative drawing experience. This was a project that we did over the course of 2 weeks, so it's very, very simple. But the purpose really is to think about building blocks. We're making building blocks that other people can use to create larger and larger distributed networks. And the meaning of these experiences become deeper and deeper as people are contributing to them. We see on the bottom a couple of current projects that are utilizing this idea. One of them's an exhibit for a botanic garden. Another, an event that we activated for Meyers, launching a Beverly Hills store. And lastly, a collaboration with Bellsberg Architects in Los Angeles and Occidental College to create a new kind of public space on a college campus that's representing what students are thinking about, working on, imagining at any given time. So that was a quick blast through. I'm finished with my presentation. And I wanted now to open up the conversation. I'll start off with, I think, a simple question. For the panel, and then I welcome the audience to participate as well. So this question of interface is really interesting to me. We saw examples, I think, of future interfaces in the case of the Bosch project that would rely on heavy public investment, but would ultimately create a very large distributed network of touch points for citizens in the Bosch area, right? Then on the other hand, we have interfaces that are literally swings. And lastly, organisms, muscles, that are becoming a kind of interface between an ecological environment and people who need information about that environment. I think it's fascinating to think about, first of all, what is the mechanism of that interface, and what is it interfacing between? Between what, and what is the meaning of changing the constituents in that formula? Thoughts about that?
For us, it's maybe the more, I'll claim the classic definition. First, the interface is the kind of entry point between the human and the device or technology, or between the humans and the humans. Mm-hmm. And it's really the intervention that we're putting out there for these connections to happen.
mean, I guess in a classical definition, an interface could be understood as a facade or a threshold, a porch, a stoop, something that you design to sort of mediate between two realms. You could say architecture traditionally mediates between degrees of privacy and publicness. We like to think that that's not just bricks and mortar, that can be expanded through thinking about ideas of performance, ideas of sociability, encouraging people to interface or interact with each other. I mean, a porch is a great interface, a stoop is a great interface. So we like to say that it's always been a kind of interface, but our interfaces are now maybe smaller scale, finer grain, more connected, more activated in more explicit ways. But we like to say that we could expand sort of definitions of architecture to become a kind of always already interface with technology, with, I think it's very exciting work in terms of, using lighting to signal invitation, or using biological systems to kind of signal larger environmental conditions.
Right, right. It's particularly interesting to me, I think, in the context of this presentation, especially because I think for digital marketers especially, the idea of interface has been really about, has not been fully exploited. I think there's been this continued thought about creating interface that allows a new broadcast channel, right? A new way for a brand or an institution to speak. And both of those examples, both of the ways that you've been talking about interface, implies much more conversation, right? It's acting more as a mediator in a dialogue rather than a new portal for broadcast. And I think that's a really important point. If we're thinking about how our work helps culture to evolve, it's important for us to recognize that the paradigm wherein broadcast and the creation of new broadcast channels is less and less relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated in all of the projects and presentations a kind of a collectivity in the interface, like you're describing, I think, and the idea of a collaborative drawing or a swing that becomes, the mechanism of people interacting together, and the interface being something about the whole city's infrastructure. I think that's in the spirit of what you're describing. It's not a broadcast channel. It's a platform for discussion and for trying to understand, new things through communication, through registering some kind of collectivity in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible, through a back and forth. And yeah, like everyone, I think I'm interested in expanding that from the typical definitions to things like society and culture. I mean, I love the engagement of people, and to transportation, to non-human organisms and ecosystems and things like that.
Right. So, given all of that, I guess the thing that keeps striking me is that I see so many versions of inspiring worlds that I want to live in. Whether we're talking about the materials that this future world will be made from, or the way in which we'll connect with each other in this future world. How do we go about making that real? You said something at the beginning of your presentation, which I found very interesting, addressing today's problems with today's technologies, which I think is very, very compelling. I think architecture as a discipline, and maybe experience design is beginning to be guilty of this as well, has thought very deeply about how culture will move into the future, how the built environment will evolve around future thinking, but has not done a great job, at least in the last half century, of realizing those dreams in a way that's meaningful for the population at large. Do you have thoughts about how we can get real?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's, again, something in the kind of ethos of the work, just from this panel about kind of collaboration. Like, I do think that, I'm seeing out of my students, when I teach, out of a younger generation, a real non-interest in solitary genius and like sole authorship, a total willingness to give up their claim to like, I'm the sole creative author behind this project. And I think that's combined with some technologies and like inspiration, like open source software development. And I think that makes it more likely that we'll move into a realm where we don't have to each create our own future independently, but we create modules of the future that are designed to work with other modules of the future, so we can advance some kind of common vision as opposed to separate visions.
I love that phrase, modules of the future. I mean, it makes me think, Muna, about your work a lot, and the way in which, the thing that I really admire, I mean, there's so much to admire about your work over the years, but one of the things I greatly admire is the way in which each idea is so concise, and so both clearly conceived, but also clearly executed in a way that's easily consumable for its target audience. And I love the idea then that those very clear ideas, very clear experiences become modules that together, if our collective work is about creating modules like that, can then be built, it's sort of in a way emerge, right, in the way that your work is exploring.
No, for sure. They're almost like quick prototypes that need to go out there, and each can only explore one facet of things or problems or challenges at a time. But then the collection of them, you're right, hopefully will give us some visions of what might be worth or not worth exploring. We'll see.
Right. Eric, have you considered it? I mean, one of the things that's interesting about your work over the years as well is that you have worked at such a variety of scales. Some of your installations, I think, in some ways are very similar to Muna's work. You've also, though, been imagining these, these 2030 transportation infrastructures. Has it ever been an explicit conversation in your office? How do we connect the dots between those two things?
I guess we talk about it all the time, the kind of incredibly schizophrenic practice that we have. We're rendering these kind of visionary projects and soldering these sort of LED, parts. I very much love these presentations about the kind of do-it-yourself, kind of make it as a prototype, get it out there, test it. That's very much our ethos as well. The presentation I showed was much more kind of packaged thing for a very particular client who had a very particular brief for us. Even though we were doing renderings, we also did build a kind of structure, a kind of table that we could present it on. So we did feel the need to physicalize some of these things. And I don't think there's something that sort of brings it all together. I mean, there's a kind of rampant curiosity, a kind of interest in technology and social behavior. But we also feel this sense that we need to materialize things, that somehow the rendering is not enough. And in fact, when someone is at the table struggling to interact with it, then that's in a way a great sort of test case for us. So even though the work was mostly rendered and smooth, I think the friction that comes out of use and frustration, that for us is the most inspiring moment. And the kind of idea of this kind of swing set that incorporates play, I mean, that's something that you don't render. It's not something that's easy to animate.
Right.
So I do love that messy space, the social space of the tangible space of engagement with the public. Maybe another thought, just sort of going back to some of the points you made earlier about publicness. I think all these are kind of public projects. They engage publics and audiences. Architecture can be very insular. It can be very private. It's about my client, my parcel, my property line. And oftentimes the public realm is sort of the exception. It's outside of my project. And we always argue that the public realm needs to be designed. It's not a kind of default condition, and how does architecture contribute to that as a platform, as a kind of a stage, how does it incite a kind of publicness? And I think it's our responsibility to promote this kind of publicness, the kind of social structure that is somehow being launched from a kind of architectural or physical platform.
Right. If that clock is any indication, we're a bit over time, but I really wanted to open up to a question from the audience if we have any questions for the panelists. Anyone?
We have time for one question.
One question, all right.
That'd be a good.
All right. I have some thoughts about that. You guys want to take a crack at it? So, This is very challenging. It's actually something I've been addressing in my teaching recently. It's difficult to incorporate meaningful education in physical design with meaningful education in digital design for regulatory reasons only. You get a person who is excited about design, who is interested in technology, and that's nearly every person who goes to art school, right? And put them in a room with the materials here, and you'll get fascinating work out. The problems are, if you want to be educating a person as an architect, there's a whole set of curricular restrictions. If you want to be educating a person as a technologist right now, there are fewer regulatory restrictions, but there's just not a framework that would allow that kind of education to be plugged into architecture in a way that's really meaningful. So I think, from the perspective of making a class right now, the world's your oyster. Get an architect and a technologist and a couple of other people together in a room and talk for 2 hours, and you'll have an incredible curriculum, imagine, that will get kids engaged. How do you turn that into a program meaningfully in 5 or 10 years? That's a whole other question, and I think we have to address some culture-level questions about what is the role of the architect, the industrial designer, in making the world now, because that role is diminished and changed in ways that we haven't fully addressed, I think, meaningfully. Thanks. Yeah. Great question.
Thank you.
All right. I think that's it.
Thank you.